They say the cold doesn't kill you all at once. It is a patient thief, a silent intruder that enters through the smallest cracks in the wood and the thinnest layers of wool. First, it steals the feeling in your extremities, turning fingers and toes into heavy, unresponsive stones. Then, it moves deeper, taking the memories of warmth, the smell of summer wheat baking under a July sun, the touch of a sun-warmed stone, the humidity of a spring rain. Finally, it asks for your dignity, leaving you huddled, shivering and broken, praying for a sleep that has no morning. In the winter of 1888, the Dakota Territory was no longer a land of promise. It had become a white tomb, a vast, featureless void where the sky and the earth merged into a single, terrifying wall of ice. Inside a small, timber-bound trading post, Silas stood over a hearth that was fast becoming a grave. He was a man whose frame had been forged by decades of hard labor, his back bent from pulling stones and his hands gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak. His beard held the frost of 60 winters, but even he had never felt a chill like this, a cold so deep it seemed to reach past the skin and vibrate against the very bone. With a voice as raspy as dry earth, he whispered the truth they both feared. The woodpile was gone. He had ventured out only an hour before, tied to the cabin by a rope, only to find that the lean-to had been swallowed. The shed was buried under 10 feet of drift, disappearing so completely that even the iron handle of the door was lost to the suffocating white. Beside him, Martha wrapped her thin arms around a bundle of rags that used to be a thick, comforting blanket. Her breath came out in jagged white plumes, each one a tiny piece of her life escaping into the hungry air. She had spent 40 years by his side, surviving droughts, locusts, and the crushing loneliness of the plains. But as she looked at the dying embers, Silas saw a flicker of something he had never seen in her eyes before: the cold weight of surrender. They were miles from the nearest neighbor, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. The wind outside wasn't a whistle, it was a guttural, primal scream, a sound like 1,000 starving wolves clawing at the cedar planks, demanding entry into the last sanctuary of the living. Silas looked down at the last log resting on the stone hearth. It was a piece of seasoned oak, no bigger than a child's arm, seasoned by the suns of seasons past. It was the only thing standing between them, and a silence that lasts forever. At 40 degrees below zero, the laws of the physical world begin to dissolve. Wood becomes as brittle as glass, shattering under the slightest impact. Steel snaps like dry twigs. Even the human heart slows its rhythm, searching for a single, solitary reason to keep beating in a world that has turned to ice. Silas knew that once this final piece of oak turned to ash, the temperature inside would drop until the very air they breathed would crystallize in their lungs. He turned his gaze toward the corner of the room, where the young trapper Thaddeus sat huddled. The boy had stumbled through their door 3 days ago, a ghost emerging from the whiteout, his boots frozen solid to his feet. Now Thaddeus was shivering so violently that the very floorboards beneath him seemed to rattle in sympathy. He was young, barely 20, with a life ahead of him that he hadn't yet learned to fully cherish. To Silas, looking at the boy was like looking at a reflection of his own youth, a life of potential that the frost was now trying to erase from the ledger. The boy's eyes were wide and glazed, already clouded by the early stages of the long sleep. The cabin was surrounded by wood, the heavy logs that formed the walls, the sturdy beams that held up the roof, yet they were freezing to death inside the very ribs of their home. Silas felt the crushing irony of their situation. They were encased in fuel, but to burn their shelter was to invite the blizzard inside. To keep it whole was to wait for death to claim them in the dark. Silas moved toward the center of the room, his joints groaning with every step, his muscles stiff as frozen leather. He stopped in front of the heavy dining table, a massive slab of oak he had carved for Martha as a wedding gift when they were both young and believed the frontier could be tamed. This was the moment where the frontier strips away the mask of the man and leaves only the raw, shivering substance of the soul. This is where the price of a single hour of warmth is paid in the history of a lifetime. Silas looked at the axe leaning against the wall, its iron head dull but heavy. He knew that once the first blow was struck, the sanctuary was broken. He wasn't just breaking wood, he was breaking the promise of a peaceful old age. He looked at Martha and then at the axe, and felt the weight of 60 years pressing down on his shoulders. The fire in the hearth flickered once, a final desperate spark, and then went out, plunging the room into a terrifying, icy blue twilight. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The first strike is always the hardest. Not because the wood is tough, though 40 years of seasoning had turned that oak into something as dense as iron, but because of the history that lived within the grain. To Silas, that table was not merely a piece of furniture, it was the altar upon which their entire life had been laid. He stood over it in the dim blue light of the dying day. The axe felt heavy in his hands, like a leaden weight pulled from the very bottom of a well. When the blade finally descended, the sound was not a clean thud, but a visceral, agonizing crack that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the cabin. It was the sound of a promise being broken, the sound of a sanctuary being dismantled piece by piece. For 3 decades, that slab of oak had been the undisputed heart of their home. It had held the weight of their meager Thanksgiving turkeys in the rare years of plenty, and the weight of Silas's tired, trembling elbows after a long, unsuccessful hunt in the lean ones. It had been dampened by Martha's tears on the night the fever took their only daughter, Sarah, 20 years ago. The marks of their lives were etched into its surface like a map of their struggles. The deep scratches from a slipping knife during a hurried winter meal, the faint, circular rings from 100 hot kettles, and a small, jagged indentation where a young Sarah had once hammered a spoon in a fit of childhood joy. Every splinter that flew into the air was a fragment of a story that would never be told again. As Silas gathered the first slivers of the table and fed them into the hearth, the room did not just get warmer, it grew profoundly emptier. Each flicker of orange light was a memory being consumed by the hungry air. The smell of burning oak filled the cabin, a scent that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a betrayal. Martha sat near the growing flame, her eyes fixed on the burning wood. She began to speak in a voice that was barely a thread, a fragile sound that struggled to rise above the relentless whistle of the storm outside. She asked Silas if he remembered the night he had finished the table, how he had stayed out in the lean-to until the moon was high in the sky, smelling of cedar shavings and honest sweat. He had told her then that it would last as long as they did, that it was the one thing the prairie could never break. Silas did not look up as he fed the fire. His eyes were fixed on the dancing flames, his mind a whirlwind of regret and necessity. He told her that the table was still lasting, it was just changing its shape. It was doing exactly what he had built it to do. It was keeping them alive, guarding them against the encroaching dark. A table, he reasoned, was of no use to a dead woman, and a home was nothing more than a wooden box if there was no heart beating inside of it. Yet the fire was a greedy guest. In the sub-zero temperatures of a Dakota blizzard, a dining table does not provide warmth for long. It burns hot and fast, a desperate burst of energy that the freezing air devours in a matter of minutes. As the heat of the oak began to seep into his joints, the winter ache that had settled into his bones began to soften, but the relief was overshadowed by a terrifying realization. Silas looked around the small room and saw the shelves he had built with such pride, the heavy chest in the corner filled with Martha's hand-stitched quilts, and the very floorboards beneath their feet. He realized with a chilling clarity that they were burning their past to buy a few more hours of a future they might never see. They were stripping their life bare, layer by layer, peeling away the evidence of their existence to stave off a death that seemed increasingly inevitable. The contrast between the warmth of the fire and the cold reality of their situation was a physical weight. a blow to the spirit that left him breathless. In the flickering light, Silas found himself haunted by visions of the life they were consuming. He remembered the heat of a Dakota summer when the sun would bake the earth until it cracked like parched skin, and the air was so thick with the buzz of cicadas that you could almost feel the sound. He would have given 10 years of his remaining life for just 1 minute of that burning July sun. He looked at Thaddeus, the young boy huddled in the corner. The lad's breathing had slowed to a terrifying rhythm, his skin turning a waxy, translucent gray, the color of a guttering candle. Thaddeus had no memories to burn. He had no wedding table to sacrifice. He only had the raw, terrifying present and a future that was shrinking with every tick of the clock. The weight of the years was heavy, but the weight of the encroaching silence was heavier. In the frontier, you do not just lose your life. You risk losing the evidence that you were ever there at all. Every piece of wood Silas threw into the hearth was a page torn out of their family history, a piece of his identity sacrificed to the frost. He looked toward the bedroom door, toward the heavy, hand-carved bed frame where they had dreamed and mourned for decades. It was the next thing that would have to go. He picked up the axe once more, his movements fluid now, driven by a grim and desperate purpose. He began to dismantle their sanctuary, knowing that by the time the sun rose, there might be nothing left of their home but the 4 outer walls, and the 3 of them, shivering in the ashes of their life. By midnight, the world outside had ceased to be a place of geography or landmarks. It was a void, a whiteout so absolute that the laws of distance and sight were discarded by the wind. The frontier had become an ocean of white, and their small trading post was a sinking ship, creaking under the weight of a storm that felt personal, as if the winter itself had developed a vengeful consciousness. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning history, but the cold was a persistent predator, finding every microscopic gap in the mud daubing and every thinning point in the logs. But as the hours stretched into the deep dark, Silas realized that the cold was no longer the only thing hunting them. Silas froze mid-motion, his hand resting on the splintered remains of the bed frame. Through the relentless roar of the blizzard, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic heavy thud against the outer wall of the cabin. It was not the random lashing of a frozen branch or the chaotic debris of the storm. It had a deliberate weight. It had intent. In the territories, men told stories to pass the long nights, tales of the ice walkers, or spirits of the storm that took the shape of those lost to the drifts. But Silas was a man of the earth, and he knew the reality was far more grounded and far more terrifying. Hostile raiding parties, driven to the brink of madness by the same hunger and cold, were known to roam the drifts. They were men who had lost their own fires and were now looking for the faint orange glow of a chimney, not to seek shelter, but to take it by force. Or perhaps it was the wolves. Not the common timber wolves that skirted the edges of the forest, but the Great Plains wolves, spectral giants of grey fur and yellow eyes that possessed a cruel animal intelligence. They knew with an ancient certainty that a cabin without smoke was a cabin full of meat, and a door without a bar was an invitation to a feast. Silas reached for his Winchester 1873, leaning against the hearth. The metal was so cold it threatened to tear the skin from his palms, a cold burn that seared like a branding iron. He checked the chamber with fingers that felt like wooden pegs, stiff and unresponsive. He had only a handful of rounds left, and in this temperature, he knew the oil in the gun's mechanism could thicken into a sludge, making the weapon as useless as a club. He whispered a low, urgent warning to Martha and the boy, telling them to stay back, to keep their shadows away from the gaps in the logs. The isolation began to warp the mind, turning the cabin into a pressure cooker of paranoia. In that level of silence, the brain starts to invent what the ears cannot find. Every groan of the timber under the wind sounded like a footstep on the porch. Every shadow cast by the dying fire looked like a crouching figure waiting in the corner. The silence of the plains is a heavy thing, but the silence inside a besieged cabin is suffocating. It is the sound of your own heart hammering against your ribs, a drumbeat of mortality reminding you how thin the line is between the living and the frozen. Silas pressed his eye to a small chink in the logs where the insulation had failed. Outside, in the swirling chaos of the snow, he saw them, faint, glowing points of light that were not stars. A pair of eyes reflected the dying orange light of the hearth, then another and another. They were not moving toward the door yet. They were circling, a slow, methodical orbit of hunger. They were waiting for the fire to fail. The pressure was psychological, a slow-motion siege that tested the marrow of a man's character. Silas knew that if they broke through, he wouldn't have the strength for a prolonged fight. He was a man of 60, worn down by decades of breaking stubborn soil and hauling riverstone, and his breath hitched in his chest with a sharp, stabbing pain. His fear was not for his own life. He had lived long enough to know the value of a day, but the thought of Martha facing the dark alone was a weight he could not bear. He looked at Thaddeus, who was drifting in and out of consciousness, his teeth chattering with a sound like stones in a tin can. The boy muttered about the wood being too thin, about the breathing he could hear through the walls. Silas realized the boy was right. The boundary between their survival and the abyss was narrowing. The predators outside could smell the desperation. They could hear the woodpile shrinking with every crackle of the flames. They were waiting for that precise moment when the last ember turned to black. For the moment, the humans inside became nothing more than cold statues in a wooden box. As the fire began to gasp for oxygen once more, Silas turned his gaze toward the heavy pine crossbar that secured the front door. It was a thick, sturdy piece of solid timber, the soul of the house, and the only thing keeping the 400-pound pressure of the gale from bursting inside. It was their ultimate defense against the storm and whatever waited within it. But as the temperature in the room plummeted and the boy's breathing became a shallow rattle, Silas looked at the axe. A desperate, terrifying choice was forming in his mind, a choice that felt like salvation but carried the heavy scent of suicide. He knew that to keep the light alive, he might have to break the very thing that kept them safe. There is a point in the human experience where the spirit stops its calculated thinking and begins to act on pure, sacrificial instinct. It is the moment where the I vanishes and only the we remains. In the small, shivering radius of the cabin, the fire was gasping its last breath. The shadows in the corners of the room surged forward like a rising tide, reclaiming the walls, the empty shelves, and the frozen faces of the living. The temperature had plummeted so low that the moisture in Silas's beard had frozen solid, pinning his silver whiskers to his wool collar in a rigid mask of ice. Thaddeus had stopped shivering, a terrifying, silent sign that his body had given up the fight. His head lolled back and his eyes were half closed, drifting into the final seductive sleep of the hypothermic, where the cold begins to feel like a warm, welcoming blanket. Outside, the thudding against the logs had stopped, replaced by something far more visceral, a rhythmic, persistent scratching. It was the sound of claws finding the gaps in the timber, testing the strength of the wood, feeling for the radiant warmth of the life trapped inside. Silas looked at Martha, and in that long, heavy silence, 40 years of shared sunrises and quiet nights passed between them. He did not need to speak. She saw his eyes drift to the heavy pine crossbar, the soul of the door. It was 4 inches of solid, unyielding heartwood, the only thing keeping the Dakota winter from bursting inside and turning their lungs to ice in a single breath. Martha whispered his name, a plea for him to stop, telling him that if he took the bar, the wind would take them all. But Silas looked at the boy's waxy face and then back at the woman he had loved since they were children. He told her that he couldn't let the fire die, that he wouldn't go into the dark, knowing he had one more thing to give, and kept it for himself. With a roar of agony that was more animal than man, Silas stood. He moved like a creature made of ancient stone, his joints groaning audibly in the frozen silence. He reached for the crossbar, As he began to lift it from its iron cradles, the wind outside seemed to scream in a sudden, high-pitched triumph. The heavy door groaned, bucking and heaving against his shoulder as the vacuum of the storm tried to rip it outward. Silas heaved his weight against the timber, fighting the entire weight of the plains, and managed to jam a heavy iron poker into the latch, a temporary metal-on-metal fix that he knew wouldn't hold for long. He laid the pine crossbar on the floor. It was a beautiful piece of wood, hand-sanded and strong, the final line of defense for their home. The sound of the axe biting into the heart of that pine was like a gunshot in the small room. Silas swung again and again, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that turned to crystals in the air. He was weeping, but the tears froze into salt ice on his eyelids before they could even fall. He was breaking their safety to build a funeral pyre for the cold. As he threw the jagged, heavy chunks of the crossbar into the hearth, the fire hissed and recoiled for a second, then roared to life with a defiant golden fury. It was a burst of light so intense it made them squint, a sun born in a fireplace. It pushed the shadows back to the very edges of the room, exposing the raw reality of their struggle. But the cost of that light was immediate. Without the crossbar, the door began to shudder like a living thing under the lash of the storm. The iron latch Silas had rigged began to bend and scream under the pressure of the 80-mile-an-hour gale. Silas did not run for the heat of the fire. He did not seek comfort. Instead, he threw his entire body against the door. He pressed his shoulder into the freezing, rough-hewn timber, his boots slipping on the frosted floorboards as he searched for purchase. He screamed for Martha to get the boy to the fire, to push him as close to the stones as possible. While he held the world out, he became a human bolt, a dam made of flesh and bone, holding back a flood of ice and teeth. Hours passed, or perhaps it was an eternity. Time ceases to carry meaning when you are the only thing standing between those you love and the infinite abyss. Silas watched through the haze of his own exhaustion as the light of the burning crossbar reflected in Martha's eyes. He saw Thaddeus stir, the boy's hands twitching as the heat finally reached the core of his blood. Silas's muscles screamed in protest, and his skin began to bond with the frozen wood of the door, tearing away in small, bloody patches every time he shifted his weight to maintain the seal. Through the cracks in the logs, he could see the spectral shapes of the wolves, their weight hitting the door in a sickening, heavy rhythm. One snout poked through a gap, snapping at his coat, teeth grazing the wool. But Silas did not flinch. He wedged his shoulder deeper into the frame, his eyes turning glassy, his grip tightening, until his knuckles were as white as the snow outside. He whispered to the darkness that it would not take them tonight, not while he was still standing, not while there was still a pulse in his chest. He was a living monument of defiance against the absolute zero of the frontier. The morning did not arrive with the warmth of a rising sun. It came as a cold, pale lavender bleeding into a bruised gold across the horizon. The violence of the night had finally spent itself, leaving the wind as nothing more than a low, mournful whistle through the chimney. The first light of dawn revealed a world that had been rewritten in ice. The snowdrifts had risen like tidal waves, high enough to swallow the cabin's windows, turning the interior into a dim subterranean cave of frost. Inside, the hearth was quiet, containing nothing but grey ash and a single stubborn wisp of smoke that drifted toward the rafters like a fading spirit. Silas remained exactly where the storm had left him, slumped against the door. He had not moved an inch since the stars faded. He was encased in a fine, glittering layer of rime ice, his heavy wool coat literally frozen to the timber of the doorframe. He looked less like a man and more like a statue carved from the winter itself. Martha was kneeling at his feet, her hands wrapped in charred rags from the remains of the table, her forehead leaning against his knee in a posture of profound exhaustion. The silence was absolute, a heavy, ringing quiet that follows a great catastrophe. When the sun finally climbed high enough to illuminate the room, it revealed a cabin that was a skeleton of its former self. The home Silas had spent 40 years building and refining had been hollowed out. There was no table where they had broken bread, no bed where they had found comfort, and no chairs to offer rest to a weary back. Even the floorboards near the hearth had been pried up by Martha's desperate fingers in the final darkest hours and sacrificed to the flame. It was a wooden ribcage stripped of its heart, yet as the light hit Silas's face, his eyes, crusted shut with ice, fluttered with the agonizing effort of a man returning from the dead. His voice, when it finally came, was a ghost of a sound, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. He asked if the boy had made it through the night. Martha, choked with a sob that broke the silence like shattered glass, told him that Thaddeus was breathing, that he was awake, and that Silas had held the door long enough for the sun to find them. It took nearly an hour of careful, painful work for them to chip Silas away from the wood. It was a slow process of carving him out of the ice he had used to seal their sanctuary. When he finally stepped back, pieces of his coat stayed behind, stuck to the frame like shed skin, a permanent, ragged reminder of where a man's body ended and his duty began. Silas looked at his blackened, frostbitten hands. The nails were cracked and bleeding, and his fingers were curled into permanent, stiff claws from the hours of gripping the frame. He looked at the empty room, at the void where their life's possessions used to be. But there is a specific kind of peace that comes after such a loss. It is the peace of a man who has nothing left to lose because he has already given everything he owned to the fire. He did not see the destruction of his work. He saw the reason they were still drawing breath. The empty space was not a sign of poverty, but a monument to their survival. Thaddeus approached him with a slow, limping gait, his face pale but his eyes clear. He gripped Silas's forearm with a strength born of a respect that transcends age. No words were exchanged, for in the high country, words are often too light for the things that truly matter. There was only a look of soul-deep gratitude. They had survived, but the frontier had taken its pound of flesh. Silas walked to the window and looked out at the vast, uncaring beauty of the Dakota plains, where the snow sparkled like a sea of diamonds, a cruel, shimmering contrast to the dark reality of the night before. He told Martha they would have to build it all again, and she, taking his frozen hand in hers, replied that they still had the trees and they still had time. And in that moment, time was the most precious thing the wind had failed to take. History is often written in the names of ambitious generals and the hard dates of great battles that shaped the maps of our world. But the true history of the frontier, the history that actually built the foundation of the land we walk upon, was written in the heavy, freezing silence of cabins just like this one. It was written in the splinters of a wedding table, the ash of a hand-carved bed, and the raw, unyielding courage of an old man's shoulder braced against a door. We often look back at our ancestors through the fog of time and see only the hardship and the struggle, viewing them as figures of stone who lived lives of soot and sorrow. But if we look closer, with a heart open to the weight of their sacrifice, we see a resilience that modern life has made us forget. They knew a fundamental truth that we often obscure with the noise of the present. They knew that everything we own, our homes, our comforts, and our most cherished belongings, is secondary to the soul standing next to us in the dark. Silas and Martha did not just survive a blizzard. They proved that the human spirit possesses a heat that no winter, no matter how long or how cruel, can ever truly extinguish. They showed us that sacrifice is not just a noble word found in history books. It is a choice made in the dead of night, when the wood runs out and the wolves begin to howl at the threshold. As you go about your day, moving through your warm homes and bright rooms, take a momentary pause to remember the ones who sat in the blue dark, waiting for a dawn they were never promised. Their blood flows through your veins, and their quiet, bone-deep bravery is your greatest inheritance. They were willing to burn their past so that you could have a future, They stood in the breach so that the line of your life would not be cut short by the frost. Their stories are the embers that keep our own spirits warm. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives in the hearts of the resilient and the brave, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Your support helps us keep these forgotten legacies alive for generations to come. Until next time, stay wild.